want to talk to you today about something that is a little bit heavier.
The Armenian genocide.
What's called the Nanjing Massacre.
Everyone hears about the Holocaust.
Definitely don't feel like any of my education included that.
And it was one of those things where I was like, why aren't more people talking about this? It really took me back.
And so are you willing to kind of go on that journey with me today?
Where the mind goes.
But I think this just kind of makes you realize too, and definitely for me, I mean, I've never seen the back end to what it takes to turn on a camera and make something happen or create something out of nothing. And it's a lot more than you think it is. And I think anytime it gives me going down this rabbit hole of entrepreneurship and content creation and putting myself in front of a camera has given me such an appreciation for just how much work it takes to film and record anything.
Yeah.
I mean, from those, Netflix documentaries to, Hollywood motion pictures down to YouTube videos where people are creating a high quality video every single week that's 20 minutes long. Like the scenes, the framings, the shots, the lighting, there's so much that goes into what looks like a 2 to 3 second clip of or portion of a 20-minute video sometimes can take an hour to record those 2 to 3 seconds.
It's amazing. Sometimes actually the shortest parts take the longest. The 90% of a video might take me 20 minutes to record, but then the 3-second intro or 3-second outro that's needed for the story to really be punchy and crisp and hit right, you know what I mean? That took me maybe 4 hours.
Yeah, so it just gives me a new appreciation for just anything from a 30-second YouTube or Instagram reel to a full-length motion picture. It's why you can tell. It's like, oh, it's okay. Game of Thrones isn't, or House of Dragon isn't coming out for another 2.5 years. It's because every shot takes 2.5 days to make. So
yeah. No, it's mind-blowing when you get into the craftsmanship of it. Hey, so I really want to talk to you today about something that is a little bit heavier, a little bit more into the messy, twisted darkness, a little bit of history.
Okay.
And so are you willing to kind of go on that journey with me today? It's a little bit different than some of the topics we've had before.
Let's do it.
Okay, awesome. So I want to start off by asking you a question, which is, has there ever been something that you've learned about history that rearranged your view of the world, right? Your narrative, the story you had in your head about the history and the way the world worked was in place, and then you learn this new piece of information, and that new piece of information just rearranged not only the way you thought about history, but the way you thought about the present and the future as a result of it.
When I was in 6th grade, I did a report on the Armenian genocide.
Whew. All right, you're starting heavy too. There we go.
Well, it's in my blood, literally. I'm half Armenian and half Jewish.
I don't think I knew that.
Oh, really?
I knew you were Jewish. I don't think I knew you were Armenian.
Maranian, as my grandmother would say it. Yeah, it's an Armenian last name. And up until that point, I mean, even before 6th grade, you've heard of the Holocaust, right? Everyone hears about the Holocaust and the absolute atrocities that happened to the Jews all across Eastern Europe. And up until this point, I had no idea that, and that was half of my heritage or my where I'm from, right, is this Eastern European Jew. And then the other part is Armenian. And I had learned that up until, I think it was, might have even been more recently than the 90s, that it wasn't even something that the U.S. government would admit to being a genocide.
Really?
Right, or recognize as a genocide. I learned about just that this happened before the Holocaust. So this was something that had already predated the Holocaust, and just kind of took me back because I had learned that both sides of my history, my ethnicity, were victims of genocide. I thought that was absolutely crazy, which made me more appreciative of even just being here in the first place. But then also this, why wouldn't a country recognize as a genocide? Who are these Ottomans that, were committing these atrocities to the Armenians back in the early 1900s? I just didn't know about any of this, and learning about it really took me aback. And it was a combination of my dad and this band System of a Down, which is a metal band that's all Armenian they had a
Oh.
song about the Armenian genocide, and I remember
Really?
like reading or learning about it, and then learning that about the song at the same time. And it was one of those things where I was like, why aren't more people talking about this? It
Yeah.
really took me back and just made me realize that there's a lot of bad things that have happened in the world that, for one reason or another, aren't as big as some of the other ones.
Dude, one, I just learned a lot about you today in a lot of different ways. So that was cool. So thanks for sharing that. And two, I also think the most I know about the Armenian genocide is the name. You know, I don't know much, and I definitely don't feel like any of my education included that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's powerful hearing that from you, knowing that that's part of your background in history and your ancestry. You know, and as well as the Holocaust and being connected to that from the Jewish part of you. And yeah, you literally have two of the most gnarly genocides in the last century that you're connected to. That's kind of wild.
I always like to say, my ancestors could beat your ancestors in a game of hide and seek.
Oh my god! Oh my god! That's brutal. That is brutal. Well, I mean, in the I guess in the thread of atrocities, why I wanted to talk about this with you today is I had one of those moments pretty recently where I learned something about history that rearranged my view of it. And now I can add what you just shared about the Armenian genocide, honestly, because I need to learn about that and be aware of that as well. But I feel like my education as a white-bodied person growing up in the United States was, when we talk about World War II, was very much shaped around what happened in Europe. It was shaped around what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust, the way the Americans were this savior who came in and fought and beat the Germans alongside the other allies, and it's just very much framed in an Americans are the heroes format, right? I feel like that is the window we are given as kids in the United States, unless you have family members who give you a different kind of window. But at least at school, that's what you're told is the narrative.
Yeah.
And I was listening to an amazing history podcaster, Dan Carlin, which I know you listen
Hardcore
to
history.
and love. Yeah, Hardcore History. Recently got into that through a friend and was listening to his series about Japan and Japan's rise to power. And Dan Carlin's whole thing is about context, and he does an amazing job where, maybe the focus of the story is on this one point in history, but he always goes back decades, even centuries before that, to help you understand how these moments lead up to maybe the focal point of the story. And one of the focal points of the story is World War II and how Japan became the force that it was, why it was trying to conquer China, and why it engaged with the U.S., why did it ally itself with the Axis powers, right? I had been given such tiny shreds of information about all of this in school. And he just laid it out. And suddenly, of course, I don't agree with the many terrible things that the Japanese Army and Navy did during World War II, nor do I agree with the terrible, terrible things the United States Army did during the Vietnam War, or if you're in Vietnam, they call it the American War of Aggression, right? It's all about framing. But I feel like I understood how these things came to be, right? And one of those things that is just gut-wrenching to me, that still messes with me, when I'm sitting maybe in a car ride, is learning about what's called the Nanjing Massacre.
Can you say that again?
And I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right. The Nanjing Massacre.
Okay, yeah. I've heard of the Nanjing Massacre.
You have,
but the same way you've heard of the Armenian Genocide, I've heard of the name.
It's a line item, and that's it.
I can tell you that it's most likely an Asian city that was a part of a massacre, and that's about it.
Right, totally. Well, what's pretty crazy about the Nanjing Massacre is how controversial it is still today. There are a lot of people who deny that it happened at all. There are a lot of people who maybe they don't deny that it happened, but they'll argue a lot of the finer points of how many people died, how many of them were actually just soldiers that were hiding as civilians, and they'll argue about the numbers, which the numbers have a huge range, right? There are some people who say, and I think China's official number is 300,000 people,
Whoa.
including civilians and soldiers, were massacred in this city.
Oh
That's
my
the high
gosh.
end.
Wait, so take me back a little bit.
Sure.
Who's doing this massacre and who's doing it to who?
Great question. So Japan, as they moved out of their isolationist period, right?
Okay.
So there was a long period in the kind of ended, I think, in the early 1800s, where Japan had cut itself off from most of the world,
Mhm.
right? And it was actually America, which I didn't know this either, who came up and was like, "You're not doing that anymore," and literally forced Japan to open.
So I heard about this a little bit. What time frame was this? Is this like
I don't remember the exact dates.
I
I
think-
believe
okay.
it was somewhere in the early to mid 1800s.
Okay.
I could be wrong about that date, but I think that's about the time frame.
Okay.
All I know is that part of what Dan Carlin talks about is how incredible it was that Japan went from essentially a feudal period,
Mhm.
right? And then I think it was within some crazy amount of like 75 to 80 years, they moved into being able to compete on an industrial level with the world powers,
Mhm.
right? And so that plays a lot into their narrative and their mindset of, they're moving from, there's a external country, the United States, who's forcing them against their will to open,
Mhm.
basically controlling them as a country, right? And now they're trying to take back their own power, right?
Yeah.
And what they're seeing in the world as they emerge from this isolationist period is there are all these colonial powers who are just taking over other countries,
Yeah.
who are taking slaves, who are dominating huge chunks of the world, and some of the folks at that time that were in power were like, well, this is the way the world works now, so we're going to participate in this. And so part of the way they started to do that, one of the countries that they attacked and began to, they maybe wouldn't term it this way, but essentially were trying to colonize or move into it becoming a colony, was China. And this was a period where China was much weaker than it had been, right?
Sure.
And
It's
so
not today's China.
it's not today's China, which also is fascinating to me because in this story, the story of Nanjing, so Nanjing is a city in China.
Got it. Okay.
We tend to think of them as, and should, as the victims of this terrible massacre that the Japanese inflicted upon them, right? But in today's world, we often think of China as, in the United States, very much with our own internal propaganda, is this evil giant superpower,
Yes.
of the East, right? So it's all about timing, it's all about framing, it's all about how you tell the story. But at least in this moment in history, this city was descended upon by the Japanese army. And, there's a lot of nuance there. I recommend you just go and read through the Wikipedia page because it will blow your mind. But essentially, they surrounded the city, demanded that they surrender. A lot of the military in the days leading up to it had just bailed, just abandoning all the civilians that were there. The ones that remained, they did end up disappearing kind of into the city and pretending to be civilians because they didn't think they could get away in time, maybe. And so the Japanese army, and everyone kind of points fingers about how this all came about.
Okay.
Right? And no, everyone's kind of pointing to somebody else. Well, this wasn't the fault of the Japanese, empire because it was just soldiers that had been away and at war too long and had become, exhausted and ravenous. And, then the soldiers blame it on the officers who said that there was just no sense of enforcement or control. But what unfolded was literally a massacre and literal rape of thousands and thousands of people and women and children over months.
Oh, this is a month.
This went from like December to March.
Jeez.
Yeah, it's wild. And so part of why they have such crazy documentation of it too is that in the city there was an international district. And so there was a group of actual Europeans that were there, and I think even maybe some Americans that created this kind of safe zone. And the way they did it is Japan was at that time allied with Nazi Germany, and so there was a Nazi there who led this group and used the Nazi flag and symbol and power to keep the Japanese away from people who were fleeing into this safe zone. But obviously that was a small amount, right? And so again, huge ranges of how many people were killed and disagreements. Some people, the lowest is like 45 people. The highest is 300,000. A lot of historians will put it between 100 and 200,000. And for reference, imagine the entire city that we live in being murdered
It's
in
insane.
4 months.
That's insane.
Right?
And what blows my mind more than anything else is well, you know what? Actually, what doesn't surprise me is the lack of knowledge or understanding by the common American. What does surprise me is the variance in the numbers. Only because the difference between 45 and 300,000 is a lot, but I'm assuming there's some context as to why someone would say only 45. What doesn't surprise me is that we don't know a lot about this. And I think this comes, I don't know, maybe this has more to do with the fact that as Americans, we're just, it doesn't seem like we have a huge interest in any historical event that didn't involve the United States. And I almost think about this from how I learned about history growing up, right? It was almost like we would have 2 months of pre-U.S. history, and then we'd have like a year of U.S. history. We would go into every detail of everything from the Revolutionary War into the 1800s and the War of 1812 to the Civil War and through the World Wars. Like everything about that is very hammered down, and we kind of just brush by everything that that either happened before the United States or didn't involve the United States. And I think that's just more has something to say about whoever creates these curriculums wanting to kind of focus the narrative on the United States and how much we've changed the world and how great we are, but I don't think they want to focus on some of the negatives and specifically the things that don't involve the United States. Unless, do you think that were the United States involved in this massacre in any capacity, or was this before the United States got involved?
No, yeah, this is before the United States was involved at all in World War II.
Yeah,
and this
I
is, I
figured.
think, even actually just before World War II really broke out
Yeah.
and became, officially called World War II. This
Yeah.
was still really just a war between Japan and China. But something you said earlier makes me want to add to it, I guess, which is I totally agree. We in the United States, especially in our education system, but also in the way we talk about the news and the way the news is communicated to us, we focus it on how amazing we are as a country, and we either completely downplay or entirely erase the terrible things we do to other countries. Again, like I recently went to Vietnam, and I went through the War Memorial Museum for what we call the Vietnam War, that the folks there called the American War of Aggression, right? Which you really start looking into that and you go, that was America, in my opinion, pretending to fight communism, but really having a proxy war with communist powers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we killed a generation of Vietnamese people for this, in my opinion, false morality, right? And so it's easy to hear about the Nanjing massacre and think, God, what terrible people. How could that happen? Well, that wouldn't be us, right? But we've done similar terrible things. If you read some of the specific like war crimes the United States committed, that I'm sure we were almost barely held accountable for at all. When you start looking at Agent Orange, there are literally Vietnamese people born today that are affected multiple generations down from Agent Orange that are born with deformities and disabilities.
Do you know enough about Agent Orange to give a quick overview of it? Because I don't know enough to give a quick overview, but I know how atrocious it was, and it's one of those first things you learn where you go, "Oh, we did some pretty messed up things in order to for what we would call the betterment of our country."
Agent Orange, I am not an expert, I'm not going to pretend to be, but anecdotally, as someone who's just interested in this in an amateur way, was a chemical that we were experimenting with in order to kill the forest so that we could see the enemy army, because they were incredible at hiding and moving through the forest and with guerrilla war tactics. And so to fight that, we were literally just killing the forest with chemicals. And we just didn't seem to really think about or care that had humongously devastating impacts on people and horrific growths and boils and incredible just deformities into people's bodies, right? And then you think about also the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Japan to end the war. And there's a lot of arguments about the morality of, well, maybe the Japanese were never going to stop. But, then you go look at all the incredibly horrific effects of those bombs dropping, in addition to the people who died instantly, but just, the fallout and the radioactive material. And the reason I want to bring this up is I think history is just a story, right? That's all it is. It's an individual and collective story that we share with each other about what has happened. That's all history is, right? And there's no such thing as a version of history that is 100% accurate. That doesn't exist. But I think we don't spend enough time understanding the weightiness and the import we have in how we share those stories with ourselves and especially our children. And by leaving out the things we are ashamed of, we allow those things to potentially happen again in the future. Mm-hmm. And I think about that a lot with where we are at today with our current election, right? It's Monday, November 4th. Tomorrow is election day in the United States. And we have two candidates. And normally I'm somebody who goes, I disagree maybe with the other side. For me, I tend to be a Democratic person. I tend to vote that way. I often disagree with what a conservative candidate would put forth, but I think disagreement is healthy, and sometimes I leaned a little bit more independent. But in this election, when you have somebody like a Trump, who, to me, as I go back and study some of these dictators, and I study, the rise of Hitler, and the split in the population in Germany about Hitler, and how propaganda and fascist ideals rose, there's just an eerie similarity there for me between that and the way Trump talks. And it's not even, to me, Trump that's terrifying. It's actually the way other people who like Trump talk about Trump and what they choose to ignore, right? And that's really what, to me, this root of all this is what we choose to ignore so that we can just stay in this little framed box that we like. That scares the absolute shit out of me, with all sorts of things, connecting this Nanjing massacre to now maybe the Armenian genocide that I need to learn more about, to electing potentially a president that in my mind doesn't really seem to have any sort of morality that I can respect.
Do you think that is a fault of humanity more than anything else? And I'll tell you why I bring that up. I don't see much difference at a very high level between how we've curated history to how we curate our own narratives about ourselves and how we move throughout the day. I mean, we don't share everything that went on throughout. If I ask you how your day was, you're not going to share everything. You're not going to also give me all the worst. You're probably going to sugarcoat things a little bit. You're probably going to brush over the things that maybe you aren't proud of the fact that you did. You're not going to highlight those things. And I'm wondering, as I'm listening to you talk about this, because it's objectively, right? These are things that people have hard opinions on one way or the other. But at the end of the day, we're arguing about whether or not something did or didn't happen. And I think human nature is such that we repress, we suppress, we express, right? And we do these in all these different ways. And a lot of it we do subconsciously, some of it we do consciously. But human nature is to, cover our faults and glorify our strengths. And I'm wondering if that's how we've gotten to the place we've gotten to today, where we've done that a little too much, right? They say history is told by the victors, right? And there's a reason for that. But that doesn't mean that the losers, if that's the opposite of a victor in this situation, don't have an opinion on how things went as well. I just don't know if it's something that as humans we are, it's natural for us to express or admit. And I'm just wondering if there's some correlation between not knowing this information. I don't know if it's a malicious thing. I actually think it's more ignorance than anything else.
I think it's both. I think there are people in power who do want to promote nationalism. And you cannot promote nationalism by talking about your F-ups, you know? Like, how do you build a national spirit in a truly nationalist state, right? Which is, you know, I think the era that we are at the tail end of, right? But that was some of the most celebrated idealism over the last 100 years is being proud of your country, right?
Mhm.
You can see that across many countries around the world. And we're still in that, but I think we're starting to baby step ourselves into a different kind of reality. But baby step, right? There's still a lot of folks and countries that are enthralled in this idea of nationalism. But I think the idea of nationalism cannot handle admitting national mistakes, right? And I think we have a culture, particularly in white culture, of minimizing and hiding and stuffing what we've done wrong as individuals. And I think that then translates to the subconscious and conscious brushing under the rug of the mess ups that we have as a nation, right? Specifically talking about the United States. But you know, listening to Dan Carlin, again, I'm not a Japanese historian, but listening to, you know, the way he has methodically gone through and listened to other Japanese historians, and then other, you know, historians from around the world look at how this happened in Japan and how that potentially led to the Nanjing massacre. There was hyper nationalism. There was a hyper obsession with that, which is why to this day there are still folks in Japan who deny and say only 45 people died. Right? It's both this conscious decision to erase and weed out, but also this subconscious unwillingness and fear of admitting that you're part of that, right?
I don't know why this just came up, but it's almost, and maybe I'm not going to create the right analogy here, but it's almost the same way people get very dogmatic about anything, right? I think when you are too dogmatic about the United States is the best, or my country is the best, or Germany is the best and the only right way, it's kind of the same way I see people who go down the rabbit hole of different diets, right? I mean, there's people online that are like, you know, meat and fruit or carnivore diet or vegan diet is the best,
Yeah.
right? And anyone who veers from that is wrong and it's the enemy and we need to stomp out the enemy for it to, you know, hyperbolize this situation, right? It's, you know, meat eaters are bad, or anyone who eats seed oils, you're bad, you're killing yourself. There's this tendency to, if you get too into the idea that one idea is the right idea, then not only do you end up hyperfixating on that and neglecting some of the potential negatives or significant negatives of that, whether it's your diet or your country, but then you also shut yourself off to this idea that anything else could be right. And maybe there's just some correlation there between, you know, how people pick their diets or their religions to how people pick their country or how much they care about their country, right? Too much of anything, especially when it's an idea, too much of any one idea usually ends up leading to ignorance. It usually ends up leading to dogma, which is just the hyperfixation on one narrative and one point and one thing is correct. And anytime you do that, you're purposefully closing yourself off to the potential myriad of other truths that could be out there.
I think that is a very accurate metaphor for the way that we just literally shut our minds off from things. And I think that's where I go, where it is both intentional and unintentional, right? When you learn new information and you choose not to really sit with it, and you choose not to sit with the discomfort of it, and then not talk about it with others, that's the intentional part, right? But we can't control that subconscious piece, right? It's subconscious. We're unaware of it. You can't know what you don't know, right? But when you get this new information, don't avoid it, right? We want so desperately to avoid these things. You know, for example, the thing that really hits home for me right in this moment is I am from the United States. I was born and raised here. I am of the heritage of Mormon pioneers, right? And the narrative I was given as a child was these brave, you know, Mormon pioneers, these people who had, you know, discovered the true religion, the true story of God, and had traveled across the country to run away from prosecutors, people who had murdered their prophet, to find the promised land, the Zion in Utah, right? Most of those people were white. And that is a story of like freedom and resilience and grit, right? And there is truth in that story. But there's also the story that I grew up in a country that was stolen land resulting from European colonizers who literally created genocide in order to steal an entire continent from people, who stole land from Mexico, who literally colonized, conquered, and stole Hawaii and all of the islands that are part of the Hawaiian Islands, who traded in and acquired Alaska, right? It's all indigenous land, and there's indigenous blood that has been spilt over from hundreds of tribes because white Europeans decided, well, this is the United States, right? And my ancestry and my people are a part of that. The pioneers that bravely moved across the country. Well, we're really just going and taking more indigenous land in other parts of the United States, right? And I think what I have struggled with and need to sit with more is that both of those realities are true, right? Those are just different narratives. And is it more one than the other? I think it's both. And how do we accept that? You know, for me as an American, which is already an arrogant thing to say since Americans call themselves Americans, but there's North and South America and Central America that don't necessarily use that framing in that way, right? But I need to be able to sit with and acknowledge that, you know, I live in a country built on both the killing of indigenous people and stealing of their land, as well as millions of people that were enslaved and killed as part of that. Like, I learned recently that one of our most important historical figures, George Washington, literally you can go to his like house museum and he has his dentures, and in his dentures, it seems like you know this, have the teeth of slave children.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yep. It's not wood like we were taught, right? We were told he has wooden teeth. No, it's the teeth of enslaved children or people. I learned that from a comedian.
So did I. It was probably the same comedian, actually.
Yep. Do you know who it was?
I can't. Is it Sean McGill?
Shane Gillis.
Shane. I don't know his name very well, apparently, but yeah, that was wild to learn, especially from a comedian. So
not from the history books.
We had to learn that
from a comedian.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And so I think the power even of a comedian being able to bring to light what we want to avoid. That's what comedians do, right? They often show us the things we want to avoid. And make us laugh, but in a lot of ways also educate us about the things we're uncomfortable, that are in the dark. And my hope is that, as we think about this upcoming election and, the decades to come, that we stop avoiding the parts of history that make us uncomfortable, and we learn to really sit with them and incorporate them into the narratives that we call history.
Where the mind goes.